Imagine being forced into a marriage with a stranger, a man whose life is controlled by power, wealth, and a father who sees love as nothing more than a weakness. That's exactly what happened to Alice, a young woman with dreams of her own who suddenly found herself trapped in a world of luxury that felt more like a prison. But what started as a cold, loveless arrangement slowly turned into something neither Alice nor James, her distant and guarded husband, could have ever expected. The small town of Willow Creek was quiet that morning, its streets lined with modest homes and the occasional shop. Inside one of those homes, Alice Carter sat by the window, her sketchbook resting on her lap. The soft morning light illuminated her delicate features, but her expression was far from peaceful. Her pencil hovered over the page, unmoving, as her thoughts swirled with unease. Alice had always found solace in her art. Drawing was her escape, her way of expressing the emotions she couldn't put into words. But today, even the comfort of her sketchbook couldn't ease the weight pressing down on her chest. She glanced toward the kitchen, where her mother, Margaret Carter, was busy preparing breakfast. The clinking of dishes and the hum of the coffee machine filled the air, but the tension between them was palpable. Margaret was a woman of quiet strength. She had raised Alice on her own after her husband's sudden death 5 years ago. Life had not been kind to them since. The once thriving family business had crumbled under the weight of debt, and Margaret had been forced to take on multiple jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. Despite her struggles, she had always put on a brave face for Alice, determined to give her daughter a better life. But now Margaret's resolve seemed to be cracking. "Alice," Alice called softly, breaking the silence. "Come sit with me for a moment." Alice hesitated, her heart sinking. She could sense that whatever her mother was about to say would change everything. Reluctantly, she set her sketchbook aside and joined Margaret at the kitchen table. The older woman's hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a cup of coffee, her eyes avoiding Alice's. "There's something we need to talk about," Margaret began, her voice heavy with emotion. "I've made a decision, one that I believe is for the best." Alice's stomach churned. "What kind of decision?" she asked cautiously. Margaret took a deep breath, finally meeting her daughter's gaze. "I've arranged for you to marry James Grayson." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alice stared at her mother, disbelief and betrayal flashing across her face. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret reached for Alice's hand, but the younger woman pulled away. "I know this is sudden," Margaret said quickly, her tone pleading, "but it's the only way to secure our future. The Graysons are one of the wealthiest families in the country. James's father, Victor Grayson, owns a luxury real estate empire. They've agreed to pay off all our debts if you marry James." Alice's mind raced. She had heard of the Graysons before everyone in Willow Creek had. They were a family of immense power and influence, their names synonymous with wealth and prestige. But what did that have to do with her? She was just a small-town girl with no connection to their world. "You're selling me off like a piece of property," Alice said, her voice trembling with anger. "How could you do this to me, Mom?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not selling you, Alice. I'm trying to save us. If we don't do this, we'll lose everything, the house, the little we have left. I've tried every other option, but there's no way out. This is the only chance we have." Alice pushed back her chair and stood, her hands clenched into fists. "You had no right to make this decision for me," she said, her voice rising. "This is my life, not yours." Margaret stood as well, her expression desperate. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but please, try to understand. I'm doing this for you. James is a good man. He's kind, and he's agreed to the arrangement. He won't hurt you." Alice shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't know that. You don't know anything about him." Margaret stepped closer, her voice softening. "I know you think I'm being cruel, but I'm trying to protect you. I've sacrificed everything for you, Alice. Please, just give this a chance." Alice turned away, her heart breaking. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape the suffocating weight of her mother's decision. But deep down, she knew Margaret wasn't lying. Their financial situation was dire and there was no easy way out. Still, the thought of marrying a stranger, of giving up her dreams and her freedom, was unbearable. "I need some air," Alice said abruptly, grabbing her coat and heading for the door. Margaret didn't stop her, simply watching as her daughter disappeared into the crisp morning light. As Alice walked through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, her mind raced with questions. Who was James Grayson? What kind of man would agree to such an arrangement? And most importantly, how could she possibly face a future that had been decided for her? For the first time in her life, Alice felt truly powerless, but even as despair threatened to consume her, a small spark of defiance flickered within her. She didn't know how, but she vowed to find a way to take back control of her life, even if it meant starting with this marriage. The day of the wedding arrived far too quickly for Alice. She stood in front of the mirror in a grand dressing room at the Grayson estate, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. The ivory gown she wore was exquisite, with intricate lace detailing and a long, flowing train. It was the kind of dress most girls dreamed of wearing on their wedding day, but to Alice, it felt like a costume, something meant to disguise her true self. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the delicate veil pinned into her dark hair. Around her, a team of stylists and assistants bustled about, perfecting every detail of her appearance. They spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the heavy silence that hung in the room. Alice barely heard them. Her thoughts were consumed by the reality of what was about to happen. She was about to marry James Grayson, a man she had never met, a man who, for all she knew, might be as cold and calculating as his father, Victor. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had tried to prepare herself for this moment, but nothing could have truly readied her for the weight of it. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Margaret stepped inside, her expression a mixture of pride and guilt. She was dressed in a simple but elegant navy gown, her hair neatly styled. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret approached, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You look beautiful," Margaret said softly, her voice trembling. Alice turned to face her mother, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I don't feel beautiful," she replied. "I feel like I'm being put on display." Margaret flinched at the words, but didn't argue. Instead, she reached out and took Alice's hands in her own. "I know this isn't what you wanted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to be strong, Alice, for both of us." Alice pulled her hands away, her jaw tightening. "You keep saying that, but you're not the one walking down that aisle. You're not the one marrying a stranger." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You're right. I'm not. But I've made my choices and now I have to live with them. I just hope one day you'll understand why I did this." Alice didn't respond. She turned back to the mirror, her reflection now blurred by the tears welling in her eyes. A part of her wanted to scream, to run, to refuse to go through with this. But another part of her, the part that had always wanted to protect her mother even when she didn't agree with her, knew she couldn't. Not now. Not when everything was already in motion. The ceremony was held in the Grayson family's private chapel, a stunning structure with high vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the marble floor. The pews were filled with business elites, politicians and socialites, all dressed in their finest attire. To them, this wasn't a wedding. It was a spectacle, a merger between two families of vastly different worlds. Alice stood at the entrance of the chapel, her arm linked with that of her uncle, who had been asked to walk her down the aisle in her father's absence. The music began to play, a soft, melodic tune that seemed to echo in her chest. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she took her first step forward. All eyes were on her as she made her way down the aisle. She could feel their gazes, their whispers, their judgments, but she kept her head high, determined not to let them see her fear. Her eyes, however, were drawn to the man standing at the altar. James Grayson. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair neatly combed and his sharp features set in a neutral expression. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, the kind that exuded wealth and power. But it wasn't his appearance that caught Alice's attention. It was his eyes. They were a deep, piercing blue, and as they met hers, she saw something unexpected, a flicker of uncertainty. For a moment, the world around her seemed to fade. She couldn't tell if it was her imagination, but James didn't look at her with the cold detachment she had feared. Instead, there was a quiet intensity in his gaze, as if he, too, was grappling with the weight of this moment. When she reached the altar, James extended his hand to her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm but not harsh, and she felt a strange sense of steadiness in his touch. The officiant began the ceremony, reciting the traditional vows that felt hollow to Alice. She barely heard the words, her mind racing with questions. Who was James Grayson really? What kind of man would agree to an arrangement like this? And why did he seem just as uneasy as she felt? When it came time for the vows, James's voice was calm and steady, though his eyes betrayed a hint of vulnerability. "I, James Grayson, take you, Alice Carter, to be my wife," he said, his words measured and deliberate. "For better or for worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live." Alice's throat tightened as she repeated the vows, her voice trembling slightly. The weight of the words felt suffocating, but she forced herself to get through them. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, James turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You may now kiss the bride," the officiant said. James hesitated for the briefest of moments before leaning in. His lips brushed hers lightly, a gesture that was more respectful than passionate. It was over in an instant, but it left Alice feeling strangely unsettled. As they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, Alice couldn't help but steal a glance at James. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed straight ahead. But there was something about the way he held her hand, firm, steady, and just a little too tight, that made her wonder if, perhaps, he was just as lost in this as she was. The Grayson estate was everything Alice had imagined it would be. Grand, imposing, and utterly lifeless. The sprawling mansion sat atop a hill, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and high iron gates that seemed to keep the world out. Inside, the halls were lined with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and priceless works of art. It was a place of immense wealth, but to Alice it felt more like a gilded cage. Her new life began the morning after the wedding. She woke up in a bedroom that was larger than her entire house back in Willow Creek. The bed was draped in silk sheets, and the windows overlooked the estate's vast grounds. But the beauty of her surroundings only deepened her sense of isolation. This wasn't her home. It was a stranger's palace, and she felt like an intruder. James had been polite but distant since the ceremony. After the reception, he had escorted her to her room, wished her a good night, and left without another word. Now, as she wandered through the endless corridors of the mansion, she couldn't help but wonder where he was, or if he even cared that she was here. Alice found herself in the dining room later that morning, where breakfast had been laid out on a long polished table. The spread was extravagant, fresh fruit, pastries, eggs, and more. But the room was empty, save for a few silent staff members who moved about with practiced efficiency. She sat alone, picking at her food, her appetite dulled by the weight of her thoughts. Halfway through the meal, James entered the room. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his hair neatly combed, and his expression as unreadable as ever. He nodded in greeting as he took a seat across from her. "Good morning," he said, his tone formal. "Good morning," Alice replied, her voice quieter than she intended. For a moment they sat in silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound between them. Alice wanted to say something, to break the awkwardness, but she didn't know where to start. James, it seemed, was in no hurry to fill the silence. Finally, she mustered the courage to speak. Do you always eat breakfast alone? James glanced up, his blue eyes meeting hers. Most of the time, he admitted. I'm usually busy with work. Alice nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had expected him to be distant, but his aloofness still stung. It was as if he had already decided to keep her at arm's length. The days that followed were a blur of loneliness and uncertainty. James spent most of his time at the Grayson Corporation, overseeing the family's luxury real estate empire. Alice, meanwhile, was left to navigate the unfamiliar world of the estate on her own. The staff were polite but reserved, and she quickly realized that they had been trained to keep their distance. She spent hours wandering the mansion, exploring its many rooms and corridors. There was a library filled with leather-bound books, a sunroom with floor-to-ceiling windows, and even an art studio that had been left unused for years. But no matter where she went, the emptiness of the house seemed to follow her. One afternoon, Alice ventured into the gardens. The air was crisp, and the scent of blooming flowers filled her senses. For a moment, she felt a flicker of peace. She found a bench beneath a towering oak tree and sat down, pulling out her sketchbook. Drawing had always been her refuge, and she hoped it would bring her some comfort now. As her pencil moved across the page, she lost herself in the familiar rhythm of creating. She sketched the garden around her, the delicate petals of a rose, the twisting branches of the oak tree. For the first time since the wedding, she felt a small sense of control, a reminder of who she was before all of this. That evening, Margaret came to visit. Alice hadn't seen her mother since the wedding, and the sight of her brought a rush of conflicting emotions. Margaret looked tired, her face lined with worry, but she smiled as she embraced her daughter. "How are you settling in?" Margaret asked, her voice tentative. Alice hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "It's different," she said finally. "The house is beautiful, but it doesn't feel like home." Margaret's smile faltered. "I know this isn't easy for you, Alice, but I truly believe things will get better. James is a good man. He just needs time." Alice frowned. "How can you be so sure? You don't even know him." Margaret sighed, her expression pained. "I've spoken to him, and I've seen the way he looks at you. He may not show it, but I think he cares more than you realize." Alice wanted to believe her mother, but the distance between her and James felt insurmountable. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was just another obligation to him, a piece of the puzzle in his carefully controlled life. Over the next few days, Alice began to notice small changes. James, though still reserved, started to make an effort to engage with her. He would ask how her day had been or comment on the books she had borrowed from the library. His gestures were subtle, but they hinted at a side of him she hadn't seen before. One evening, as they sat in the library, James surprised her by asking about her art. "I noticed you've been spending time in the gardens," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Do you like to draw?" Alice looked up from her book, startled by the question. "Yes," she said cautiously. "It's something I've always loved." James nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'd like to see your work sometime." The comment caught her off guard, but it also sparked a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to James Grayson than the cold, distant man she had married. The library had become Alice's favorite place in the Grayson estate. It was a quiet refuge, filled with the scent of old books and the soft glow of warm lamplight. She often spent her evenings there, curled up in one of the oversized armchairs with a sketchbook or a novel. It was one of the few places in the house where she felt at ease, away from the watchful eyes of the staff and the weight of her new reality. One evening, as she sat sketching by the fireplace, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to see James standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, and an unreadable expression on his face. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice calm but tentative. Alice blinked in surprise. In the weeks since their wedding, James had rarely sought her out. He was polite and cordial, but their interactions had been brief and formal. This was the first time he had made an effort to spend time with her. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. James sat down, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp, as if he were studying her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The crackling of the fire filled the silence, and Alice felt a flicker of nervousness under his scrutiny. "What are you working on?" he asked, nodding toward her sketchbook. Alice hesitated, unsure if she wanted to share something so personal, but there was a genuine curiosity in his tone that made her relent. She turned the sketchbook around, revealing a detailed drawing of the garden outside. James leaned forward, his eyes scanning the page. "That's impressive," he said, his voice carrying a note of admiration. "You have real talent." Alice felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. "Drawing has always been my way of processing things, I guess." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can see that. It's a gift to be able to create something so beautiful out of what you feel." His words caught her off guard. She had expected him to offer a polite compliment, not something so sincere. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the man behind the polished exterior, a man who, perhaps, understood more than he let on. Over the next few days, their interactions became more frequent. James would join her in the library or the garden, sometimes bringing a book or simply sitting nearby as she sketched. Their conversations were still cautious, but they began to open up to each other in small ways. One evening, as they walked through the garden together, James surprised her with a question. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" Alice stopped in her tracks, caught off guard by his directness. She looked up at him, her expression guarded. "I didn't have much of a choice," she admitted. "My mother, she thought it was the only way to save us." James nodded, his jaw tightening. Victor has a way of making people feel like they don't have a choice. Alice studied him, sensing the bitterness in his tone. "What about you?" she asked. "Why did you agree?" James hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because it was expected of me," he said finally. "My father has always treated my life like a business transaction. This marriage was just another deal to him." Alice felt a pang of sympathy. For all his wealth and privilege, James seemed just as trapped as she was. "Do you ever wish things were different?" she asked quietly. James turned to her, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Every day," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As the days turned into weeks, Alice began to see more of James's true self. He was still reserved, but there were moments when his guard slipped, revealing a man who was thoughtful, intelligent, and surprisingly kind. He would ask about her art, her favorite books, and her life before the marriage. In turn, he shared stories about his childhood, his love of architecture, and his complicated relationship with his father. One evening, as they sat in the library, James pulled a book from the shelf and handed it to her. "This was one of my favorites growing up," he said, a faint smile on his lips. "I think you might like it." Alice took the book, her fingers brushing against his. The gesture was small, but it felt significant. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. James nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned back to his own book. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with an unspoken understanding. Their connection deepened further one rainy afternoon. Alice had been sketching in the sunroom when James walked in, his suit jacket draped over one arm. He looked tired, his hair slightly disheveled, but his expression softened when he saw her. "Busy day?" she asked, setting her sketchbook aside. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You could say that. My father's been pushing me to close a deal I'm not comfortable with." Alice frowned. "Why don't you just say no?" James gave a bitter laugh. "It's not that simple. In his eyes, saying no is a sign of weakness." Alice hesitated before speaking. "You're not weak, James. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." James looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't know me well enough to say that." Maybe not, Alice admitted, but I've seen enough to know that you're more than what your father thinks you are. For a moment, James didn't respond. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. That night, as Alice lay in bed, she found herself thinking about James. He was still a mystery to her in many ways, but she could feel the walls between them beginning to crumble. For the first time since the wedding, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this marriage wasn't just a transaction. Maybe, just maybe, it could become something more. The fragile connection between Alice and James was beginning to grow, but the Grayson estate was not a place where peace lasted for long. Beneath the surface of their tentative bond, the pressures of their arranged marriage and the expectations of the Grayson family loomed like a storm cloud. It wasn't long before that storm broke. It started with Victor Grayson. Victor was a man who commanded every room he entered, his presence as sharp and cold as the suits he wore. He had built the Grayson empire with ruthless efficiency, and he expected the same from his son. To Victor, emotions were a weakness, and love was a distraction. Alice had seen little of him since the wedding, but when he summoned her to his office one afternoon, she knew it wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. The office was as intimidating as the man himself. Dark wood paneling, shelves lined with leather-bound books, and a massive desk that seemed to swallow the room. Victor sat behind it, his piercing gaze fixed on Alice as she entered. "Sit," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Alice obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, as if he were dissecting her with his eyes. "I've been watching you," Victor began, his voice low and measured. "You've done well to keep up appearances, but let's not pretend this marriage is anything more than what it is, a business arrangement." Alice's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm aware of that," she said evenly. Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Good. Then you'll understand why I'm telling you this. My son has a future to protect, and I won't allow anyone, least of all you, to jeopardize it." Alice's heart pounded in her chest. "I don't understand," she said, though she had a sinking feeling she did. Victor's eyes narrowed. "James has responsibilities, obligations that go far beyond this marriage. If you think for 1 second that you can distract him from those obligations, you're mistaken. Your role is to support him, not to interfere." The words stung, but Alice refused to let him see her falter. "I have no intention of interfering," she said, her voice steady. "But James is his own person. He can make his own decisions." Victor's lips curled into a cold smile. "You're naive if you think that. James has been groomed for this life since the day he was born. He knows what's expected of him, and he knows better than to let emotions cloud his judgment." Alice wanted to argue, to tell Victor that James was more than the puppet he seemed to think he was, but she knew it would be pointless. Victor Grayson was a man who saw the world in black and white, and there was no room for shades of gray. When she left the office, her hands were trembling. She had always known that her marriage to James was part of a larger plan, but hearing it laid out so bluntly made her feel like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. And yet, as much as Victor's words angered her, they also strengthened her resolve. She wouldn't let him dictate her life or James's. The tension between Alice and Victor soon spilled over into her relationship with James. That evening, as they sat in the library, she couldn't keep her frustration bottled up any longer. "Your father spoke to me today," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. James looked up from his book, his brow furrowing. "What did he say?" Alice hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "He made it very clear that he doesn't think I belong here, that I'm just an accessory to your life." James's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might defend his father, but instead he sighed and set his book aside. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "He had no right to say that to you." Alice blinked, surprised by his response. "You're not going to defend him?" James shook his head. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to his expectations. But the truth is, I don't agree with most of what he says or does." Alice studied him, her anger softening. "Then why do you let him control you?" James's gaze dropped to the floor. "Because it's easier than fighting him. He spent years building this empire, and he expects me to carry it forward. If I push back, it'll only make things worse." Alice reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to live your life for him, James. You're more than just his heir." James looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain. "It's not that simple, Alice. You don't know what he's capable of." Alice wanted to press him further, to understand the full extent of Victor's influence, but before she could, James stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," he said, his voice distant, "but some battles aren't worth fighting." Alice watched him, her heart aching. She wanted to help him, to show him that he didn't have to face this alone, but she also knew that James had to make that choice for himself. The breaking point came a week later, during a dinner party hosted by the Graysons. The event was a lavish affair, attended by business elites and socialites who seemed more interested in flaunting their wealth than enjoying each other's company. Alice felt out of place among the glittering crowd, but she did her best to smile and play the part of the dutiful wife. James, however, seemed more tense than usual. He spent most of the evening at his father's side, listening as Victor discussed a new business deal. Alice could see the strain in his posture, the way his jaw clenched every time Victor spoke. As the night wore on, Alice found herself cornered by one of Victor's business associates, a man who clearly saw her as little more than a trophy wife. His condescending remarks and thinly veiled insults made her blood boil, but she bit her tongue, unwilling to cause a scene. When James finally noticed what was happening, he stepped in, his expression dark. "That's enough," he said, his voice cold. "You don't speak to my wife that way." The man laughed, clearly unbothered. "Relax, James. I was just making conversation." James's eyes narrowed. "Find someone else to talk to." The man's smile faltered, and he quickly excused himself. Alice looked up at James, her heart pounding. It was the first time he had openly defended her, and the intensity in his gaze left her breathless. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Alice nodded, her anger giving way to gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. James hesitated, then reached for her hand. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that. You don't deserve it." Alice squeezed his hand, her chest tightening. In that moment, she saw the man James could be, the man he wanted to be, if only he could break free from his father's shadow. That night, as they sat together in the library, James finally opened up. He told her about the pressure he had faced growing up, the constant need to prove himself to a father who was never satisfied. He spoke of his dreams of becoming an architect, dreams he had abandoned to take his place in the family business. Alice listened, her heart breaking for him. "You don't have to give up on your dreams, James," she said. "It's not too late." James looked at her, his expression filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Maybe," he said softly, "but if I'm going to fight for them, I need someone by my side." Alice met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I'm here, James. I'll stand by you, no matter what." For the first time, James smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up his face. And in that moment, Alice knew that their marriage was no longer just a transaction. It was the beginning of something real. The days following James' confession marked a turning point in their relationship. For the first time, Alice felt like they were truly partners, not just two strangers bound by an arrangement. James began to open up more, sharing his thoughts, his frustrations, and even his dreams. In return, Alice found herself trusting him in ways she hadn't thought possible. But as their bond grew stronger, so did the pressure from Victor Grayson. Victor's control over James was suffocating, and Alice could see how it weighed on him. Every decision James made was scrutinized, every move calculated to fit into Victor's grand plan. It was clear that James wanted to break free, but the question was how and at what cost. One evening, as they sat together in the library, James brought up the topic that had been looming over them for weeks. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant, "about what you said, about not living my life for my father." Alice set down her sketchbook, her heart racing. "And?" James leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I want to leave the Grayson Corporation." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. Alice stared at him, her eyes wide. "Are you serious?" James nodded, his expression resolute. "I've spent my entire life doing what my father wanted, but it's not what I want. I've always dreamed of starting my own architecture firm, designing buildings that mean something to people. I think it's time I finally do it." Alice felt a surge of pride and relief. "James, that's amazing, but what about your father? You know he's not going to let you go without a fight." James's jaw tightened. "I know, but I can't keep living like this. If I don't take control of my life now, I never will." Alice reached for his hand, her grip firm. "Then I'll stand by you. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." James looked at her, his blue eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Alice. I don't think I could do this without you." The decision to leave the Grayson Corporation set off a chain of events that neither of them could have anticipated. When James informed his father of his plans, Victor's reaction was as explosive as they had feared. "You're a fool," Victor spat, his voice cold and venomous. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, it's all for you, and you're just going to walk away?" James stood his ground, his expression calm but firm. "I appreciate everything you've done, but this is my life, not yours. I want to build something of my own." Victor's eyes narrowed, his face a mask of fury. "You think you can survive without me, without the Grayson name? You'll fail, James, and when you do, don't expect me to be there to pick up the pieces." James didn't flinch. "I'd rather fail on my own terms than succeed on yours." Victor's gaze shifted to Alice, who stood silently by James's side. "This is your doing, isn't it?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've poisoned his mind, filled his head with these ridiculous ideas." Alice met his glare, her voice steady. "James made this decision on his own. He's stronger than you think." Victor's lips curled into a sneer. "You're nothing but a distraction, a liability. And when this all falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you." James stepped forward, his voice sharp. "That's enough. Alice is my wife, and I won't let you speak to her that way." Victor's expression darkened, but he said nothing more. Instead, he turned his back on them, his silence more cutting than any words. The fallout from James's decision was immediate. Victor cut him off financially, severing all ties and leaving him to fend for himself. It was a harsh blow, but James refused to let it deter him. With Alice's support, he began laying the groundwork for his new architecture firm, pouring his heart and soul into the project. The days were long and challenging, but they were also filled with a sense of purpose that James had never felt before. Alice stood by his side every step of the way, offering encouragement and helping him navigate the obstacles they faced. Together, they began to build a life that was truly their own. One evening, as they sat in their modest new apartment, James turned to Alice with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever regret this?" he asked. "Leaving the estate, the money, the security?" Alice smiled, her eyes warm. "Not for a second. For the first time, I feel like we're living for ourselves, not for someone else. That's worth more than anything Victor could ever offer." James reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'm grateful every day that you're here." Alice's heart swelled with emotion. "You don't have to deserve me, James. We're in this together." As the months passed, James's firm began to take shape. It wasn't easy, There were setbacks and moments of doubt, but with Alice's unwavering support, he persevered. Slowly but surely, his dream was becoming a reality. Their relationship, too, continued to grow. The walls that had once separated them were gone, replaced by a deep trust and understanding. They were no longer two strangers bound by an arrangement. They were partners, equals, and, most importantly, a team. The turning point came when James landed his first major project, a community center in a struggling neighborhood. It was a far cry from the luxury developments his father had built, but to James, it was everything he had ever wanted. The project was a chance to make a real difference, to create something meaningful. Alice was there every step of the way, helping him with designs, offering feedback, and cheering him on. When the project was finally completed, they stood together at the grand opening, watching as the community came together to celebrate. "This is just the beginning," James said, his voice filled with hope. "There's so much more I want to do." Alice smiled, her hand slipping into his. "And I'll be right here with you." That night, as they sat together on the balcony of their apartment, James turned to Alice with a look of quiet determination. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad my father forced us into this marriage." Alice raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Really?" James nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "If he hadn't, I might never have met you, and I might never have found the courage to live my own life." Alice leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. "I guess we both found something we didn't expect." James wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Something real. As they sat together under the stars, Alice realized that their journey, though difficult, had been worth it. They had broken free from the chains of expectation and built a life that was truly their own. And in doing so, they had found something far more valuable than wealth or power: love, freedom, and the promise of a future they could shape together. The grand opening of the community center marked a turning point not just for James's career but for their lives as a whole. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for: freedom, purpose, and a life built on their own terms. The applause from the crowd that day wasn't just for the building, it was for the hope it represented, for the lives it would touch, and for the man who had dared to step out of his father's shadow. For James and Alice, it was the beginning of something new, but as they soon learned, new beginnings often came with their own challenges. The weeks following the opening were a whirlwind. James's firm began to attract attention, not just for the quality of his work, but for the heart behind it. He had made it clear from the start that his focus would be on projects that served communities, not just the wealthy elite. It was a bold move and one that set him apart from his father's legacy. But with success came scrutiny. Victor Grayson, true to his word, had cut all ties with James, but that didn't mean he was done trying to control him. Rumors began to circulate in the business world, whispers that James's firm was struggling financially, that he was in over his head, that he would come crawling back to the Grayson Corporation before long. Alice could see how the rumors affected James, even if he tried to hide it. He worked long hours, often late into the night, determined to prove himself, but the pressure was immense. And there were moments when doubt crept in. One evening, as James sat at his desk staring at a set of blueprints with a furrowed brow, Alice walked in with 2 cups of tea. She set one down in front of him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're overthinking it," she said gently. James looked up at her, his expression weary. "I just want to get it right. This project could make or break us." Alice pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "You've already proven yourself, James. The community center was a success, and people are starting to see what you're capable of. You don't have to carry this weight alone." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just about me, Alice. It's about us. I want to give you the life you deserve." Alice reached for his hand, her grip firm. "You already have. I don't need a mansion or a fortune. I just need you." James's eyes softened, and for a moment, the tension in his shoulders eased. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," he said quietly. Alice smiled, leaning in to kiss his cheek. "You don't have to deserve me. We're in this together, remember?" As the months passed, James's firm began to gain traction. He secured a series of smaller projects renovating schools, designing affordable housing, and creating public spaces that brought communities together. Each project was a step forward, a testament to his vision and determination. Alice, too, found her own sense of purpose. She began teaching art classes at the community center, sharing her passion with children and adults alike. It was a small but meaningful way to give back, and it brought her a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. Their lives were far from perfect. There were still moments of doubt, of struggle, of wondering if they had made the right choices. But through it all, they had each other. And that, they realized, was enough. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their apartment, James turned to Alice with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet, "about the future." Alice raised an eyebrow, curious. "What about it?" James hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I want to build something more, not just for us, but for the people we care about. A legacy that's about more than money or power." Alice smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You already are, James. Every project you take on, every life you touch, that's your legacy." James shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "I couldn't have done any of it without you. You've been my anchor, Alice, my reason to keep going." Alice leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft. "And you've been mine." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Then James spoke again, his tone more serious. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, turning to face her. "Do you ever think about starting a family?" Alice blinked, caught off guard by the question. "A family?" James nodded, his expression earnest. "I know we've been focused on building our lives, but I can't help thinking about what it would be like to have a child, to create something together that's ours." Alice's heart skipped a beat. The thought of starting a family had crossed her mind before, but she had always pushed it aside, unsure if they were ready. Now, as she looked into James' eyes, she saw a vulnerability and hope that mirrored her own. "I think about it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I think I'd like that." James's face lit up with a smile, and he reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Then let's make it happen. Together." The decision to start a family brought a new sense of purpose to their lives. It wasn't long before Alice discovered she was pregnant, and the news filled their small apartment with joy and excitement. James threw himself into preparing for the baby, designing a nursery and reading every parenting book he could find. Alice, meanwhile, found herself sketching more than ever, her art reflecting the hope and love that filled her heart. When their daughter was born, it was as if the final piece of their puzzle had fallen into place. They named her Clara, after Alice's late grandmother, and from the moment she entered the world, she became the center of their universe. Years later, as James and Alice stood together at the grand opening of his latest project, a state-of-the-art community center that bore their daughter's name, they couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had been worth every struggle, every sacrifice. As the crowd applauded, James turned to Alice, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Alice smiled, her hand slipping into his. "No, James, you did it. You built this life, this legacy, and I couldn't be prouder." James pulled her close, his voice soft. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they stood together, watching Clara run through the crowd with a bright, carefree laugh, Alice realized that their story wasn't just about breaking free from the past. It was about building a future, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of endless possibility. And in that moment, she knew they had truly found their new beginning.